I wasn't planning on writing this, but I've been staring at the same ceiling for hours, and I guess at some point you stop pretending things are fine and start admitting they happened. So, yeah? Hi. I'm William. And this is one of those stories people always say sounds like fiction, until you realize there are gaps in the world where people used to be. There's a phrase I heard once during all of it. A missing witness is a person who disappeared just before being interrogated. At the time, I remember laughing at how clinical that sounded. Like disappearance was just another administrative inconvenience. Now it feels like something carved into my ribs. This happened a few years back, but the way it started goes even further. I wasn't some mastermind, or at least I didn't feel like one. I was just someone who kept backing himself into corners and convincing himself there was always a way out if you pushed hard enough. That's the honest truth I don't usually include when I tell versions of this story out loud. The situation, in short, was that I was already involved in something I shouldn't have been. Not accidentally wrong place at the wrong time, either. More like a series of small decisions that slowly stopped feeling like decisions at all. By the time things escalated, I told myself I was just maintaining control. That I was managing outcomes. That I wasn't really in danger of anything spiraling. That's the lie I was living in. And then there was the witness. I won't go into names or anything yet, partly because it still feels unreal to type them, partly because I'm not sure I can. But this person was supposed to be a problem for me. Not in a dramatic sense at first, just a loose end in a situation that was already getting too tight. Someone who knew enough that if they spoke at the wrong time, everything I'd been holding together would come apart. The irony is, I didn't even think of them as a person, in the beginning. Not really. That's something I've had to sit with since, how easy it is to mentally shrink someone down into a variable in your own stress. What I told myself back then was simple. I just needed to stay ahead of things. Make sure certain conversations never happened. Make sure timelines didn't align in ways that would hurt me. I remember thinking it was just strategy. Just survival. But underneath all of that was something worse. Panic dressed up as logic. And that's where it started to shift. Because once you accept that mindset, even quietly, even for a moment, everything starts to feel like it's either under your control, or slipping out of it forever. I didn't see the missing witness as a disappearance yet. At first, it was just another moving part in a situation that I was still telling myself I could manage. That was the beginning. In the next part, I'll go into how I convinced myself I was prepared for what came next, and how wrong that word turned out to be. When I say prepared, I don't mean anything like the clean, intentional planning people imagine when they hear that word. It was messier than that. It was late nights where I couldn't sleep, replaying conversations in my head until they stopped sounding like reality and started sounding like threats. It was convincing myself that if I just anticipated every possible outcome, I could prevent the worst one from happening. I started tracking patterns, when certain people were around, when messages were likely to come in, how long it usually took for things to escalate. At the time, I told myself I was just being careful. In hindsight, it was obsession dressed up as foresight. What's strange is how normal life still looked from the outside. I went to work. I answered texts. I even laughed at things that weren't funny. But underneath all of it, there was this constant background noise in my head, like a radio stuck between stations. And the witness, he started to feel less like a person I knew and more like an event that was waiting to happen. I thought I was preparing for control. I didn't realize I was preparing for loss of it. The shift from preparation to something else didn't happen in a single moment. It was more like waking up one day and realizing you've been holding your breath for so long you forgot what normal breathing feels like. The witness situation started tightening around me in ways I couldn't ignore. Conversations changed tone. People who used to speak casually around me started choosing their words more carefully. Or maybe I was just imagining it. Back then I couldn't tell the difference anymore. What I do remember clearly is the feeling of being watched without actually seeing anyone watching. It's not paranoia in the dramatic sense. It's quieter, more persistent. Like your instincts are constantly nudging you and you keep telling them to shut up. I told myself I still had options. That nothing was fixed yet. That I could still steer things. But every attempt to think logically just circled back to the same point. There was information out there that didn't belong outside, and I couldn't undo that. That's when I started to understand that control was never something I had. It was just something I borrowed temporarily. The days leading up to what happened next feel, in my memory, strangely ordinary. That's the part that unsettles me the most. There wasn't a dramatic turning point with music in the background or some sudden moral awakening. Just routine, broken up by flashes of anxiety I kept learning how to ignore more efficiently. I remember the witness was still present, in the sense that I knew where they were, or at least I thought I did. That kind of knowledge is deceptive. It gives you the illusion that distance equals control. At some point, I stopped thinking in terms of outcomes and started thinking in terms of inevitability. That's a dangerous shift. Once something becomes inevitable in your mind, you stop questioning whether you should be heading toward it at all. I won't describe what I told myself I was doing in detail, because even now it sounds like someone else trying to justify themselves through my voice. But I can say this. I remember the moment I crossed from hesitation into action feeling less like a decision and more like momentum taking over. And once momentum starts, it doesn't really ask permission. I wish I could say there was a clean plan at that point, something structured and deliberate, but it wasn't like that. It was more like a series of small alignments I convinced myself were under control. Timing, location, access, these words sound organized, but in my head they were just fragments I kept rearranging until they looked like certainty. I remember checking things repeatedly, not because I was discovering new information, but because repetition made me feel like I was reducing risk. That's a trap I didn't recognize at the time, the belief that if you think about something enough, you can outthink consequence itself. The witness had a routine, or at least I believe they did. That belief became the foundation of everything I built in my mind. If their behavior was predictable, then the rest of it could be shaped around that predictability. But there's always a gap between what you think you know and what is actually true. I just didn't respect that gap enough. Looking back, I can see how much I was already committed before I admitted it to myself. The day it actually unfolded still doesn't feel real in the way other memories do. Most memories have edges. You can trace where they begin and end. This one is more like static that replaced something important. I remember moving through it on autopilot. That's the only way I can describe it honestly. There wasn't a clear internal voice guiding me anymore, just a dull sense that things were already in motion and I was simply inside them. At one point I caught myself noticing how normal everything looked around me. People going about their day, completely unaware of any internal collapse happening in parallel. That contrast stuck with me more than anything else. There was no dramatic realization mid-event. No sudden regret or clarity. Just a narrowing focus, like the world had reduced itself to a tunnel and I was moving through it without fully understanding why I was still moving. I won't pretend I remember every detail clearly. Some parts are missing, and I don't think that's accidental. It's like my mind refused to store them in full resolution. What I do remember is the silence afterward. That's where everything changed shape. What happened after is where the story stops behaving like a story. There's a before and after line in my life that isn't visible to anyone else, but I feel it every day. Before, I was someone constantly managing risk. After, I was someone trying to understand what parts of my own memory I could actually trust. People started asking questions, not directly at first, but in that careful way questions are asked when the answer is already suspected. I remember conversations where I had to keep my face steady while internally trying to reconstruct what I had done hour by hour. The phrase, missing witness, started appearing in indirect ways. Not spoken to me, but around me. Like I was standing near a conversation I wasn't fully included in anymore. That's when I realized something unsettling. Uncertainty can feel like guilt, even when you're not sure what you're guilty of yet. And the worst part wasn't fear of being caught. It was fear that I already had been, and just hadn't understood it yet. The first time I was asked to clarify a timeline, I underestimated how heavy that phrase can feel. It sounds harmless on paper. In reality, it's like someone quietly placing your memory under a microscope and asking you to prove it isn't already damaged. I remember sitting there trying to stay consistent. Not truthful, consistent. That's a different thing entirely, and I didn't realize at the time how quickly those two concepts can split apart. The strange part was how normal the questioning felt. No shouting, no dramatic accusations. Just calm voices, careful pauses, and repeated returns to small details I hadn't thought about in days. That's when I started noticing gaps in my own recall. Not big cinematic blackouts, just tiny inconsistencies that didn't line up anymore. A time here that felt too long. A moment there that felt too short. And the witness, the name I was avoiding even in my own head, kept surfacing indirectly. Always as a question, never as a statement. Like they were already gone from the narrative, but not from the investigation. After the questioning started, my life shrank in ways I didn't notice immediately. At first it was subtle, less spontaneous contact, fewer reasons to be in public spaces longer than necessary, a constant feeling that any casual interaction might contain a hidden purpose. I began rereading my own messages like they belonged to someone else. That's the part that really unsettled me. Not what I said, but how normal I sounded while saying it. It made me question whether normality is just a performance people get better at over time. Sleep became fragmented. Not insomnia in the dramatic sense, just shallow rest where my mind kept looping through the same fragments without resolution. I'd wake up unsure if I had dreamed a detail or actually remembered it. The witness was still officially missing, but that word started to feel less descriptive and more like a placeholder. Missing from where? From when? From whose certainty? Every time someone said it, it sounded less like an update and more like an unfinished sentence waiting for me to complete it. And I started to feel like I was part of that sentence too. At some point, I stopped trusting the idea that silence meant safety. Silence started to feel like compression, like the situation wasn't calming down, just tightening without making noise. People around me began to behave differently, or at least I interpreted it that way. A glance that lasted half a second too long. A question asked twice in slightly different wording. Small things that I couldn't decide were coincidence or pattern. I tried to anchor myself in routine, but routine becomes unreliable when you're actively monitoring yourself inside it. Even simple actions, walking into a room, checking a message, answering a question, started to feel like tests I might be failing without knowing the criteria. The witness case kept resurfacing in fragments. Not direct references, but echoes. Missing, unavailable, not yet accounted for. Each version of it felt less like information and more like pressure applied from different angles. And I realized something uncomfortable. I was no longer just worried about what others knew. I was worried about what I might say if I stopped carefully controlling every sentence. The strangest phase was when I started doubting not just what I had done, but whether my memory of events had ever been stable in the first place. It sounds like a convenient excuse when written down, and I know that. But inside the experience, it didn't feel like evasion. It felt like erosion. Like every time I tried to hold on to a detail, it would lose definition at the edges. I started writing things down, not to preserve truth, but to check consistency. Even that failed. Notes I made earlier didn't always feel familiar later. Same words, same structure, but lacking emotional recognition, like reading a transcript of someone else's thoughts. Investigators, or whatever label fits what they were doing, didn't need to push hard anymore. The gaps did the work for them. Silence became its own kind of testimony. And the missing witness stopped being a person in my mind entirely. It became a fixed point everything else seemed to orbit around, without me ever being able to touch it directly. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from realizing you can't reliably explain yourself to other people anymore. Not because they refuse to understand, but because you're no longer sure what version of events you're even supposed to offer. I found myself rehearsing conversations I hadn't been asked to have yet. Building explanations in advance, then discarding them when they started sounding too certain. Certainty became suspicious to me, almost more than uncertainty. The outside world kept moving at its usual speed. That contrast was jarring. People laughed in hallways. Phones rang. Life continued with an indifference that felt almost insulting when I was constantly inside my own head trying to stabilize something that wouldn't stay still. The missing witness case remained unchanged publicly, but internally it had become something else entirely, less a case and more a gravity well. Everything I thought about eventually curved back toward it. Even when I tried to think about unrelated things, my mind would quietly redirect. And I started to understand that I wasn't just being questioned by others anymore. I was being questioned by my own inability to be consistent. What scared me most wasn't confrontation, it was normal conversation. Because normal conversation assumes shared reality, and I no longer felt fully entitled to that assumption. I remember being asked simple questions and feeling my mind split in two, one part answering automatically, the other part watching the answer being formed and wondering if it matched anything real. There were moments when I would leave a room and immediately try to reconstruct what I had just said, as if I needed to audit myself for inconsistencies. That habit got worse over time, until even short interactions felt like something I had to verify afterward. The missing witness became less of a topic and more of an absence everyone seemed to navigate around carefully. Not ignored, managed. There's a difference. People manage absences when they don't want them to become too loud. I started noticing how often silence can be used as structure. Not emptiness, but support beams for conversations that can't directly mention what they're built around. And I realized I was now living inside one of those structures. By the time I understood how unstable everything had become, it was already too late to tell where the instability began. Inside me or outside me, that distinction stopped being useful. I tried returning to earlier versions of myself through memory, like retracing steps in a building that had been partially remodeled without warning. Some rooms felt familiar. Others didn't feel like mine at all, even though I knew I had been there. That's when I started questioning something more uncomfortable than guilt: authorship. Not just of actions, but of interpretation. Who decides what an event means, when even the sequence of it feels unreliable? The missing witness remained officially unresolved, but in my head it had become something more abstract than a person or a case. It was a boundary marker. A point beyond which certainty stopped working properly. I stopped trying to resolve it cleanly. Instead, I began focusing on what remained consistent across all versions of the story: my reactions, my fear, my attempts to maintain coherence. And those were the only things that never changed shape, no matter how the details did. In the end, nothing resolved in the way people expect stories to resolve. There was no single moment of clarity, no clean explanation that tied everything together. Just a gradual narrowing of possibilities until what remained felt less like answers and more like endurance. I stopped trying to defend a version of events, mostly because I stopped believing there was a stable version to defend. Every time I revisited the past, it shifted slightly, not in dramatic ways, but enough to make certainty feel performative. The missing witness was still missing, officially. Unchanged. But in my experience of it, it had transformed into something that couldn't be located in time anymore. It was just there, as absence. Persistent, shaping everything around it without needing to be visible. What I learned, if learned is the right word, is that the mind will always try to build structure around chaos, even if the structure is wrong. Especially if it's wrong. And my warning, if there is one, is simple. The moment you start relying on your own consistency as proof of truth, you're already closer to collapse than clarity.